Today, the world is shaking because Africa has just taken a decision that will reshape global power forever. A bold move that blocks the $25 trillion mineral flow Europe desperately depends on. And now, the entire European EV market is collapsing like a house of cards. This is not just economics. This is a historic shift in power. When Africa made the decision to halt the unchecked outflow of its minerals, it was not just an economic move. It was a declaration of dignity, sovereignty, and historical correction. For decades, the world treated Africa as a warehouse of resources rather than a partner in development. Trillions of dollars worth of minerals left the continent while the people who lived on the land remained in poverty. But today, Africa is saying something different. Today, Africa is saying that the era of exploitation is over. And I want you to understand that this decision did not happen overnight. It came from years of watching our lithium leave without batteries being built here, watching our cobalt feed foreign technologies while our young people searched for jobs, watching our rare earths power global progress while our own progress remains slow. This moment is the result of awareness, unity, and the courage to finally say enough. When African leaders sat together and reviewed the true value of our minerals, more than $25 trillion, they saw clearly that Africa does not lack wealth. Africa lacks control over its wealth. So this decision to block the outflow is not an act of aggression. It is an act of protection. It is Africa refusing to remain at the bottom of the value chain. It is Africa saying that transformation must happen here, not somewhere thousands of miles away. Because how long will we watch trucks leave our mines and return with expensive finished products that our own people cannot afford? How long will we export the raw materials that make electric cars while our streets remain full of old imported vehicles? How long will foreign companies take the lion's share while our miners risk their lives for crumbs? This decision is history demanding balance. And yes, this move has shocked the world because many never believed Africa would have the unity or confidence to do it. But the truth is that Africa was observing the global race for minerals closely. Europe pushing for electric vehicles, China dominating battery production, the U.S. scrambling for supply chains. Everyone understood that the world cannot move into the future without African minerals. And so Africa finally understood the power it holds. When a continent supplies more than half of the world's cobalt, a third of its key battery minerals, and enormous reserves of copper and lithium, it is not a spectator in global politics. It is a central player. And central players must negotiate, not obey. So Africa made the bold choice to halt exports until fair terms are established, until processing plants are built on African soil, until African workers gain the skills and jobs that come with manufacturing, until our governments receive royalties that reflect the real value of what leaves our ground. This is not isolationism. This is transformation. And it is long overdue. Because an Africa that only exports raw materials will always remain weak. But an Africa that processes, manufactures, and exports finished products, that Africa becomes unstoppable. And let us be clear, this decision is not about fighting Europe or punishing Europe. It is about ending an unfair system. It is about telling the world that Africa will no longer give away wealth for free while others build empires from our resources. If the global economy relies on African minerals, then the global economy must treat Africa with respect. That is the message behind this blockade. That is the message behind this moment. This is Africa standing up, not with anger, but with logic, fairness, and vision. This is Africa taking the future into its own hands. This is Africa finally using its power. And what comes next will determine not just our destiny, but the balance of the entire global market. When Africa took the bold step to halt the flow of its critical minerals, the shockwaves were felt fastest and hardest in Europe. Because Europe's electric vehicle market, its battery factories, and its entire green transition were built on one unspoken assumption, that Africa would always provide minerals cheaply, quietly, and endlessly. But when Africa said no more, the foundations of Europe's EV ambition began to shake. Suddenly, the continent that once felt secure in its supply chains found itself scrambling, confused, and exposed. And it became clear that Europe's dream of a fully electrified future was never truly in Europe's hands. It was in Africa's. Factories across Europe were already operating under pressure, rising energy costs, stiff competition from China, and a consumer market that wasn't moving fast enough. But minerals were the lifeline. Cobalt from the Congo, lithium from Zimbabwe, nickel from Madagascar, rare earths from Burundi and South Africa, copper from Zambia and the DRC. These elements were the heartbeat of Europe's battery production. Without them, the entire system would slow, weaken, and eventually stall. And that is exactly what we are witnessing: battery manufacturers delaying production. Today, EV assembly plants reporting shortages, car companies warning investors about disruptions, even policymakers in Brussels suddenly speaking with urgency, almost desperation, about a critical mineral independence, something they never prioritized until Africa closed the gates. What Europe is facing now is a reality it never expected: the realization that its entire green strategy depended on a continent it underestimated. Europe planned to sell millions of electric cars every year. It planned to lead the world in battery innovation. It planned to transition away from diesel and gasoline, believing that cheap African minerals would always support that transition. But the moment Africa changed the terms, Europe's carefully built structure started to crumble. Because it was built on the wrong assumption, the assumption that Africa had no alternatives, no strategy, and no leverage. Now Europe must confront a truth it avoided for decades. You cannot build a future on resources that do not belong to you. And you cannot lead a global transformation when you refuse to respect the regions that make it possible. The shortages being felt today are not just economic. They are symbolic. They reveal how deeply dependent Europe is on Africa, not just for minerals, but for momentum. And this dependence is not something Europe can solve in 1 month or 1 year. New mines take decades. New partnerships require trust, and trust cannot exist without fairness. Today, European leaders are sitting in emergency meetings discussing how to respond. Should they pressure Africa? Should they negotiate? Should they try to turn to other countries? But no matter the strategy, the conclusion remains the same. Without Africa, Europe's EV market cannot survive. It cannot grow. It cannot compete with China, which already has long-term deals across the continent. It cannot produce at scale without the minerals that Africa controls. And it cannot meet climate targets if the supply chain remains broken. Europe now faces a slowdown that could reshape its economy. Prices for electric cars are rising. Production timelines are being pushed back. Investors are losing confidence. Even European citizens are questioning the future of the electric transition, asking if they were promised something that was never realistic. And all of this is happening because Africa finally asserted something simple: value must stay where value is created. This moment is teaching Europe a lesson it should have learned long ago. Respect is not optional. Partnership must be equal. The era of taking without giving is over. If Europe wants access to Africa's minerals, it must accept Africa's terms that ensure local processing, local jobs, local development, and local power. Because Africa is not trying to destroy Europe's EV market. Africa is trying to build its own future. And Europe's crisis is simply the cost of ignoring Africa's voice for too long. What we are seeing today is not the failure of Africa's decision. It is the failure of Europe's assumption that Africa would never make one. Africa's shift toward retaining control of its mineral wealth is sending waves far beyond its borders. And nowhere is the impact more visible than in Europe's electric vehicle ecosystem. As African nations tighten export rules and demand on continent refining, Europe suddenly finds itself scrambling for stable supply lines that it once took for granted. For decades, the arrangement was simple. Europe needed cobalt, lithium, manganese, platinum, and rare earth elements, and Africa shipped them out cheaply, unprocessed, allowing European industries to pocket the real profits. But now, the entire chain is being re-engineered at the source. That old model is disappearing, and the consequences are unfolding faster than Europe ever anticipated. The European EV industry was built on predictable costs, steady supplies, and a sense of security that raw materials would always be available at the price Europe wanted to pay. But Africa's stance has changed the rhythm. When African governments realized that a $25 trillion stream of minerals was flowing outward with barely a fraction of its value staying behind, the shift became inevitable. New policies demanding local processing have reshaped the geopolitical landscape. The message is firm. No more exporting raw wealth. Africa will export finished power. And as this unfolds, Europe's EV market is entering a period of shock. Because its supply chain wasn't designed for a world where Africa holds all the leverage. Europe's industries now face skyrocketing material costs, uncertain delivery timelines, and the need to renegotiate trade agreements on terms they never had to consider before. This is not a temporary disruption. It's structural. When the Congo says cobalt must be refined locally, when Namibia restricts lithium exports, when Zambia and Zimbabwe push for battery manufacturing zones on their own land, Europe's factories feel it immediately. Assembly lines slow down. Production forecasts shrink. Automakers that once boasted confidently about their electric future now warn shareholders that targets may be missed. And underneath it all is the realization that Africa is no longer participating in the old global economic hierarchy. It is rewriting it. What makes the situation even more difficult for Europe is timing. The EV race is intensifying worldwide. China dominates battery manufacturing and already has deep mining partnerships across Africa. The United States is racing to build alternative supply chains. Asian companies are investing billions to secure long-term mineral rights. Europe enters this moment, not as a leader, but as a region trying to catch up. And Africa's new policies have effectively placed a gatekeeper at the center of Europe's green ambitions. Without African minerals, Europe cannot manufacture batteries at scale. Without batteries, its EV industry cannot survive. And without a strong EV industry, Europe's climate goals collapse before they even begin. The situation is becoming a wake-up call for European policymakers, who now realize that sustainability isn't just about reducing emissions, it's also about securing the minerals that make clean energy possible. Europe is attempting to diversify, exploring potential supplies from Canada, Australia, and South America. But these alternatives are limited, more expensive, and unable to match Africa's richness or sheer volume. So Europe finds itself returning to the negotiation table, this time with far less bargaining power. Africa, meanwhile, is stepping into a new era. The continent is building processing plants, partnering strategically with nations that respect local value creation, and setting the stage for its own industrial rise. For the first time, African nations are shaping the global AV market instead of simply feeding it. By controlling mineral flow, Africa is influencing technological development, geopolitical alliances, and the future shape of the global economy. And as Europe's EV market struggles with weakening supply chains, rising production costs, and intense pressure to adapt, the world is witnessing a historic shift. The flow of power is beginning to reverse.